Before children watched shiny gadgets being unboxed on screens, we unboxed poverty on a quiet kitchen table. You look at this old shoebox and you'd never guess it once held more treasure than any jewelry case I've ever seen. The cardboard is soft now, rounded at the corners, the logo on the lid rubbed almost smooth by fingers that are mostly gone from this world. It smells faintly of dust and dried paper, and if you hold it close, there's just the tiniest whisper of cedar from the shelf where it slept for decades. What if I told you that inside this plain little box are the richest gifts my family ever owned, gifts that cost almost nothing, yet bought us everything that mattered? What if the most precious presents you'll ever receive don't come wrapped in glittery paper, but in calloused hands and late-night stitches? Tonight, as the year draws toward its end and December presses its cold face against the window, I'm going to open this box with you. I've kept it closed for so long that even my own children have forgotten it exists. But you're old enough now to understand. We're going to unbox poverty itself and see the love it managed to smuggle into our lives. Have you ever wondered whether a simple shoebox could hold more real wealth than a bank vault? This box lived most of its life under my mother's bed. Back when our whole house was little more than 4 thin walls, a sputtering stove, and a roof that leaked in at least 3 honest places, this shoebox was the most forbidden thing in the house. Not for children's fingers, Mama would say, sliding it back into the shadows whenever she caught me staring. I remember being 7 years old, lying flat on my belly on the splintery floor, my cheek pressed so close to the boards that I could smell the cold dust. I'd stretch my arm under the bed until my fingertips brushed the cardboard corner of this very box. Just that touch, just knowing it was there, felt like touching a secret. What kind of treasure does a poor family keep hidden in a shoebox, do you think? Gold coins? Old jewelry? A stack of emergency dollars that could save the day? No. We were too poor even for those fantasies. Our treasure was different. It was made, not bought. Earned, not ordered. Loved into existence by people who had nothing left to give but their time and their hands. If you listen closely when I lift this lid, you might hear more than cardboard. You might hear the clatter of dishes from a kitchen long gone, the murmur of voices late at night, the cough of a tired father trying not to wake the children. You might hear all the winters this little box has survived. So, come closer. Sit here with me at the table where so many meals were stretched and so many stories were told. Let your elbows find the worn spots in the wood, and your eyes rest on these crooked old hands. We'll open the past together, one fragile gift at a time. Because by the time we close this lid again, I hope you'll understand something I took far too long to learn. We weren't empty-handed, we were just holding a different kind of wealth. I slide my thumb beneath the edge of the lid. The cardboard sighs as it lifts, particles of dust floating up like tiny ghosts in the lamplight. Right on top, resting as if it always knew it would be first, lies the smallest of them all, a doll, no bigger than my hand. She is pale, her body twisted from dried corn husks that have darkened with age to the color of old parchment. Her dress is just another husk, wrapped and tied with a faded thread that used to be red. Her hair is tiny strands of dried silk from the top of the corn, once golden, now nearly white. You might look at her and think she's nothing. A child today would pass her by in a heartbeat for a plastic toy with blinking lights. But this doll once held a whole winter together. Have you ever held something so fragile you were afraid your own heartbeat might break it? That winter, the year my corn husk doll was born, we had less than we'd ever had before. The factories had shut down one after another, like streetlights going dark. Men walked home in the afternoon instead of the evening, their lunch pails swinging empty, their faces already tired by noon. My father was one of them. Our house shivered that year. You could feel the wind inside as much as out. Mama stuffed old rags in the cracks around the windows and hung an extra blanket over the front door, but the cold still found us, slipping in like a stray cat we couldn't refuse. Money? There was no such thing. There were only decisions: coal or flour, boots or medicine, thread for repairs or sugar for Christmas candy. Christmas. Even now that word feels heavy. When you are a child, Christmas is supposed to mean surprises, paper, shiny things. But that year, Christmas meant a silence between my parents that settled over the house like fresh snow. One night, I woke up and heard them talking in the kitchen. Their voices were low but tight, like a rope pulled between two trees. "We can't just have nothing under the tree, Tom," my mother whispered. "The children will understand," my father answered, though he didn't sound like he believed his own words. I lay there, stiff with listening, my breath held so shallow it hurt. Isn't it strange how children always know when something is wrong, even when no one tells them? The next day, when the gray afternoon laid itself over the fields outside, Mama took me with her to the barn. We had no cows anymore, sold them the summer before to keep the house, but the barn still smelled of old hay and animals and rain. On the far side, near the back wall where last summer's corn had been stacked to dry, Mama spread a worn flour sack on an upturned crate. She picked up the driest, cleanest husks, her fingers working with quiet certainty. I'd seen her braid my sister's hair, embroider initials on handkerchiefs, men's socks until there was more patch than original cloth, but I'd never seen her do this. "What are you making?" I asked, my breath puffing out in small clouds. She only smiled, a tired, crooked smile that never quite reached her eyes that winter. "Just keep me company," she said. Her hands moved, folding and twisting the husks until they began to look like a tiny body. A pinch here, a twist there, a strand of husk wrapped around the waist to keep the shape. Have you ever watched something come into being right before your eyes, knowing the only raw materials were love and desperation? She tied the narrow waist with a piece of red thread she pulled from the hem of her own apron. Later I'd realized that every little piece she used for us came off something she should have kept for herself. By the time the light had faded so much that the barn was mostly shadows, the doll was finished. Mama held her up to the last, thin strand of daylight. "She doesn't look like much," she said softly. "But perhaps, for a little girl with imagination, she'll be enough." She placed the doll in my hands. I felt the ridges of the husk under my fingertips, the tightness of the thread, the smallness of her. She weighed almost nothing, yet I couldn't breathe for the weight of what she carried. "You made this, for me?" I whispered. "For you," Mama said. "For you, and maybe for the little girl you'll be on Christmas morning when you forget how hard this year has been." I wanted to cry, but I didn't. Children of poverty learn early not to add their tears to the burdens their parents already carry. Instead, I asked, "Why didn't you wait for Christmas?" That was when her face changed. For a moment, the tiredness fell away, and she looked almost fierce. "Because," she said, "some gifts aren't meant to be surprises. Some gifts are meant to hold your hand all the way through the hard parts." That night, I slept with the corn husk doll under my chin, her stiff little body pressed between my hands. The room was so cold my breath clouded the air, but with her there, I felt, if not warm, then at least not alone. What do you think a child holds onto when there's nothing else to cling to? As winter deepened, my brothers and sisters caught onto the doll's magic. First my younger sister, Mary, whose cheeks were always pink from the cold and whose toes never quite defrosted until May. She begged to hold the doll, just for a little while. Then my brother James, who was old enough to pretend he didn't care, but who secretly tucked the doll into his coat pocket when he went out to check the empty henhouse. Soon, the doll was no longer mine alone. She became our shared secret, our joint custody of hope. We passed her between us like a candle in the dark, each taking a turn to feel her dry little body against our palms. Of course, even in a house bound together by love, sharing is never easy. One evening, Mary and James tugged at the doll at the same time, each claiming it was their turn. I watched the husk stretch and twist, my heart pounding. "Stop it!" I shouted, lunging forward. "What if you tear her?" They froze, horror dawning on their faces. Mary's lower lip trembled. James stared at the ragged bit of loosened thread as if he'd broken something alive. In that silence, our father came in, his shoulders rimmed with snow, his boots leaving melted print after melted print across the floor. "What's all this?" he asked, his voice more weary than angry. We held our breath. Mama looked up from the table where she was patching his one good work shirt. She took in the scene, the frayed thread, Mary's tears, my clenched fists, then set down her needle. "Tom," she said quietly, "come see the doll." He stomped the snow off his boots and came closer. When he saw the little figure, mostly husk and hope, something in his face crumpled. "Lucy," he murmured to my mother, "you made this?" She nodded, her eyes shining in the firelight. He looked at us then, all of us crowded around that fragile toy, and the worry lines between his brows eased, just a little. "You know," he said slowly, "when I was a boy, we had a toy between 5 of us. A wooden horse with only 3 legs. Didn't stop us from racing him across the floor till the splinters flew." We all looked at him, surprised. He never talked much about his own childhood, as if poverty were something you locked away so your children wouldn't catch it. He reached out and picked up the doll, his big, rough fingers unbelievably gentle. Then, to our astonishment, he kissed the top of her husk head. "This little lady," he said, "will last us through more winters if we treat her right. Share her. Take turns. And remember, she's not just a toy. She's proof your mama can make something out of nothing." Isn't that what all parents in hard times are trying to do, make something out of nothing, so their children don't grow up feeling like they are nothing? That winter, when the coal ran low and we could see our breath in the kitchen, when supper was more often watered-down soup than anything you'd call a meal, the corn husk doll stood upright in the center of our little wooden table. She watched us eat, watched us argue, watched us play. At night, whoever had had the roughest day got to sleep with her. When Mary came down with a fever, the kind that makes a child's skin hot and their eyes too bright, she lay staring at the ceiling, teeth chattering between heat and cold. The house had no medicine beyond homemade remedies and prayers whispered into the dark. I crept into the room and slipped the doll under her arm. Mary's fingers closed around the little husk body automatically. "She'll stay with you," I whispered. "She's not afraid of fevers." Mary managed a hoarse little laugh. "Is she afraid of the dark?" "No," I said firmly. "She was born in the dark of the barn. Dark doesn't scare her at all." Sometimes I wonder if that doll did more healing than the hot cloths and bitter teas Mama made. Children need something to believe in almost as much as they need food. Years later, when the worst of the poverty had passed and we had moved to a slightly better house with fewer cracks and a real stove, Mama packed the doll carefully in this shoebox. "The children are growing," she said. "They'll break her without meaning to. Some things need to rest between generations." She laid the doll down as gently as if she were placing a baby in a cradle. Then she closed the lid, and with it, a whole chapter of our lives. And so, my little corn husk girl slept. She missed first dances and graduations and weddings. But she was waiting, you see. Waiting to be woken up by someone who would understand that she was never just a toy. And tonight, that someone is you. I lift the doll now from her cardboard nest, my fingers slower than my mother's but trying just as hard not to damage her. Her husks are more brittle, her thread more faded, but she is still here. Still standing. What if the smallest things we keep are holding the biggest pieces of who we were? I set her gently to one side of the table, near your hand. "Go on," I say. "Touch her. Careful, she's older than both of us together." You smile, a little uncertain, as your fingertip grazes the ancient husk. For a moment, the years fold in on themselves, and I can almost see my sister Mary's feverish little hand curled around exactly the same spot. But the doll isn't alone in this box. There are other gifts, other makeshift miracles pulled from the thin air of hard years. Beneath a layer of yellowed tissue paper, I feel the solid tap of wood against my fingers. Here he is. I lift him out, a wooden toy soldier, no taller than my hand. His paint is chipped, the once crisp blue of his coat worn down to soft gray in places. One boot is missing a bit from the toe, and the nose that was once a proud little point is now rounded from years of being gripped by anxious fingers. This soldier marched through a different kind of war. Have you ever had something to hold on to when the world outside your window sounded like it might break apart? By the time the wooden soldier came into our lives, we weren't hungry in the same way anymore. The worst of the depression had rolled on, like a storm cloud moving to another county. But another kind of darkness had arrived, one with flags and uniforms and names of places we'd never heard before filling the radio at night. War. My older brother, James, the same boy who once tugged too hard on the corn husk doll, had grown into a tall, restless young man. He wanted out of the small town, out of the fields, out of the memory of all those winters of not enough. The war, foolish as it seems now, looked to him like a door. Mama saw it as a hole. One August afternoon, we sat at this same table. Well, the wood was newer then, and the legs didn't wobble when you leaned on it, and watched James spread out the enlistment papers. The sunlight caught the gold in his hair, the stubborn set of his jaw. "You don't have to do this," Mama said, her voice low. "You can wait. Let them take someone else's sons first." James didn't look up. "This isn't about being first," he muttered. "It's about doing something that matters for once." "Your life matters," she shot back. "The work you do here matters. Your presence at this table matters." Their words clashed in the air between them. I sat very small in my chair, twisting my hands in my lap, wishing I could be invisible. Have you ever watched two people you love pull in opposite directions, knowing that no matter who wins, something precious will tear? In the end, of course, the world outside our house was louder than Mama's pleas. James signed the papers. He folded them with the same careful movements he used when he smoothed his hair before church, as if neatness could make this choice respectable. The night before he left, he went out to the shed behind the house and stayed there long after dark. We could see the small square of lamplight through the cracks in the boards, flickering like a heartbeat. When he finally came back in, his hands were dusty with wood shavings. He smelled like pine and sweat and the sharp tang of determination. He sat down beside me on the bed and held out the little wooden soldier. "For you," he said. The soldier's coat was newly painted then, bright blue with little buttons dotted in with a pin. Its hat sat straight on its head, and tiny eyes had been carved with the tip of James's knife. "I don't want it," I said, though my fingers reached out even as I lied. "I want you to stay." He looked away, his throat working. "I can't give you that," he said finally. "But I can give you this. When you're scared, you hold on to him, and you remember that your brother is out there, standing up straight, doing his duty, and thinking of you." Anger bubbled up in me, hot and childish. "If you're so brave," I snapped, "why do you need me to remember you at all?" He smiled then, but it was a thin, crooked smile. "Because," he said quietly, "being brave doesn't mean you aren't afraid. It just means you do the thing anyway, while your heart hammers against your ribs. And sometimes, it helps to know that somewhere, someone is holding on to a little piece of you." That night, after the house had gone still, I crept to the window with the wooden soldier in my hand. The stars looked hard and far away, like nails hammered into black velvet. I pressed the soldier's wooden back against my lips. "I promise," I whispered to the dark, to the fields, to whatever was listening. "I'll keep you safe until he comes home. I won't let go." Have you ever made a promise to something that couldn't answer back? The war years rolled on. News came in fits and starts, wrapped in static and fuzzy voices on the radio. Names of battles that hadn't existed when we were children became part of our nightly prayers. We learned to read my mother's face as she sorted the mail. No envelope with a government seal meant we could breathe for one more day. The wooden soldier lived in my pocket. He went with me to school, to the store, to the creek on the rare days when we could afford to pretend the world was normal. The paint wore away where my thumb rubbed his chest, right over where his wooden heart would be. One night, the sirens wailed. Not the war sirens from the radio, we didn't have those here, but the ones from town that meant a storm was coming. The sky had turned a sickly green, like bruised fruit, and the wind sounded like it was searching for something to tear apart. Mama herded us down into the root cellar, baskets of potatoes and jars of canned beans pressing in close around us. The air was cool and damp, smelling of earth and old harvests. As the storm raged overhead, the walls trembling with each burst of thunder, I wrapped my fingers around the wooden soldier so hard the edges dug into my skin. "If our house blows away," Mary whispered in the dark, "where will James find us when he comes back?" I swallowed, closing my eyes. He'll find us anywhere, I said. Soldiers always find their way home. The promise sounded thin even to my own ears. The storm passed. The house held. Life resumed its fragile rhythm. Then one spring day, as the lilacs were just beginning to think about blooming, a car pulled up in front of the house. It was the kind of car that didn't usually stop on our road, shiny, official-looking, out of place among the dust and chickens. Two men stepped out, both in uniforms. They walked up the path, their shoes too clean for our dirt. Mama saw them through the window. For a second, her face went blank, wiped clean of everything. Then she turned away, made the sign of the cross out of old habit, and called for my father. We children saw the envelopes, the way the men held them like something too heavy to carry and too fragile to drop. We heard the words, regret to inform, though after that, everything turned loud and silent all at once. James did not come home. The little wooden soldier, though, was still in my pocket, his paint chipped, his edges worn, his small carved face unchanged by the news that had aged us all 10 years in an afternoon. That night, when the house finally stopped echoing with other people's footsteps and the casseroles dropped off by neighbors had gone cold on the counter, I took the soldier out and set him on the table, right next to the silent radio. You failed, I hissed at him, anger boiling hot and wild. You were supposed to bring him back. My fingers closed around him, and for the first time in years, I wanted to throw him, to watch him shatter against the wall, to make something break on the outside that matched how I felt inside. Have you ever been so hurt that you wanted to destroy the only thing that connects you to the one you lost? Mama's hand closed over mine before I could throw. Her grip was firm, but her voice, when she spoke, was gentler than I'd ever heard it. Don't, she whispered. Don't you dare. Tears blurred my vision. What good is he now? I choked out. What good is a toy soldier that couldn't protect the real one? Mama swallowed hard. For a second, I saw her eyes travel to the old corn husk doll on the shelf, to the worn patches on the tablecloth, to the photographs on the wall. She took a deep breath. Things we make with our own hands, she said slowly, they don't have the power to change what happens out there. She nodded toward the window, where the night pressed its heavy face against the glass. But they can remind us who we were while it was happening. They can show us that even in the middle of fear, we knew how to love. She loosened my fingers one by one, prying them away from the little soldier. Then she held him up, his chipped paint catching the weak light. Your brother carved this with hands that had known hunger and cold and hard work. He took a piece of scrap wood, something no one wanted, and turned it into a promise. Don't you see? This isn't a failure. It's proof that, before the world took him, he knew how to give. Her voice broke on that last word. I stared at the soldier through fresh tears. His small wooden eyes seemed to look back at me with quiet patience. What do I do with him? I whispered. She pressed the soldier back into my hand. Hold him, she said. And when your heart aches so much you think you can't stand it, you remember that love is what made this, and love is what hurts now. And love is what will carry you forward. That night, I slipped the wooden soldier under my pillow. I dreamt of trains and oceans and far-off places I'd only ever heard of on the radio. In the morning, the world was still broken in the same way, but I had something solid to grip when the grief came in waves. Years later, when I packed the soldier into this shoebox, I wrapped him in one of James's old handkerchiefs. It still smelled faintly of the shaving soap he used the year he left. I laid the soldier on top of the corn husk doll, our toy army of two, both veterans of battles money could never have won. Isn't it strange how the poorest things we touch can end up carrying our richest memories? Beneath them, at the very bottom of the box, lies something larger. Not a toy, not really. More like a second skin our family wore for generations. I fold back the tissue paper and my fingers sink into softness. Fabric, layered upon fabric, stitched and restitched until the original pattern is nearly lost beneath the history. I lift it slowly, letting it unfurl in the warm light of the kitchen. A patchwork quilt. It is not beautiful, not in the way magazines would tell you beauty works. The squares are not even. Colors collide where they ought to coordinate. A scrap of faded floral crashes up against a bit of checkered work shirt, a piece of baby blanket nestles beside striped feed sack cloth. The stitches wander like a child's first attempts at writing, some too big, some too small, none of them machine perfect. But to me, this is the finest blanket ever stitched. Because this quilt is a map, and every square is a story. Have you ever pulled a blanket over your shoulders and felt not just fabric, but hands, so many hands, tucking you in from the past? My grandmother started this quilt, long before my corn husk doll was born, long before James carved his wooden soldier. She lived through her own hard times, storms of a different name, but just as ruthless. Whenever a shirt grew too thin at the elbows or a dress became too short for a growing girl, she would cut around the strongest pieces and add them to the growing pile in her sewing basket. Nothing wasted, she'd mutter, more to herself than to us. Not if I can help it. One evening, when I was still little enough to fall asleep in a chair, I woke up to the sound of her humming at the kitchen table. The lamp cast her face in soft, golden shadows, highlighting the concentration in the lines around her mouth. "Come here, little one," she said, patting the chair beside her. I climbed up, rubbing sleep from my eyes. "What are you making?" I asked, eyeing the growing squares of fabric laid out in front of her. "A blanket of days," she replied. "For nights when it feels like the cold might last forever." She pointed to a square of blue cloth, once bright but now dulled by years of washings. "This was your mother's dress the summer she turned 15, she said. She wore it to the county fair the night your father first worked up the courage to ask her to dance." I imagined my mother, young and laughing, spinning in that dress under strings of bare bulbs. Grandma's fingers moved to a piece of striped fabric. "And this," she continued, "was Grandpa's work shirt the year the well ran dry. He wore it every day hauling water from the creek. Near wore it to threads, he did. But the shoulders held, so the shoulders get to live on." Her hand hovered over a tiny bit of soft yellow flannel. "This came from the blanket we wrapped you in when you were born. You were so small, we thought the world might forget to feed you." I smiled sleepily, burrowing my cheek into my own shoulder. A quilt, you see, is more than scraps. It's a ledger of survival. During the worst winters, that quilt was more reliable than the stove. The stove might give out if the coal ran low, its belly cooling into silence, but the quilt held heat captured from the bodies it wrapped. We huddled under it on nights when the wind howled like something alive, counting the stitches the way some children count sheep. One December stands out more sharply than the rest. It was the first winter without James. Grief had settled over the house like a second snowfall, quiet and heavy. We didn't have the heart to decorate a tree that year. The strings we used to hang popcorn felt too much like the strings that had pulled our lives apart. On Christmas Eve, snow piled against the door so high that it took my father a full hour to dig a path just wide enough to let the cold in. We sat around the kitchen table, the quilt wrapped around our shoulders like a shared cloak. Mama laid out what little we had, a loaf of day-old bread from Mrs. Harper down the road, a small wedge of cheese, a pot of thin stew that tasted mostly of onions. No feast. No carols. Just the sound of our spoons and the occasional crackle from the stove. Then Grandma, who had grown quieter since James's death, stood up. "Bring the quilt," she said. We dragged it to the center of the floor. She spread it out carefully, smoothing the wrinkles with hands that had stitched most of them into being. "Look," she said, pointing to a square of sturdy brown wool. "This was from your great-grandfather's coat the winter he walked 10 miles in a blizzard to bring home flour. He nearly didn't make it, but he did. And that night, his wife baked bread and thanked the Lord for every crumb." Her finger moved to a faded pink square. "And here, this was from the dress your Aunt Rose wore the day she buried her first baby. She thought she'd never smile again. But the year after, she had twins who cried loud enough for 3. She went on like that, each scrap a story of something almost lost and then, somehow, saved, or something lost that still left behind a trace of love." By the time she finished, the room felt different. The air was still cold, the food still plain, but our sorrow had company. We were not the first to hurt, and we would not be the last to heal. Isn't it strange how knowing other people have survived their storms can make your own storm feel just a little less endless? After Grandma passed, Mama kept the quilt going. Whenever life tore something, she'd mend it, with another patch, another story. The year I married your grandfather, a piece of my white dress went into the quilt. Not from the front where people could see, but from the inside hem, where only I knew it had danced. The year your grandfather fell off the ladder fixing the roof and broke his arm, his favorite plaid shirt was cut and added in. We'll remember, Mama said, placing it next to a square of sky blue cotton. Remember how he healed. Not just how he fell. Under that quilt, babies were born and fevers were sweated out. Letters were written, tears were shed, secrets were whispered. When the electricity went out, which it did often, in those early years, we'd light a candle, pull the quilt tight, and tell stories until the darkness outside felt like a friendly blanket instead of a threat. One January, when the snowdrifts outside reached the bottom of the windows and your mother was still a little girl, she came down with a cough that rattled in her chest like loose coins in a tin. The doctor, who we could barely afford, came once, left a small bottle of medicine, and shook his head on the way out. For 3 nights, we barely slept. I sat in the rocking chair with her hot little body against my chest, the quilt wrapped around us both, rocking and humming every lullaby I had ever been sung. Her breath would hitch, then catch, then rattle on. Each time it paused, my own heart did too. On the 4th night, in the darkest hour before dawn, her breathing eased. Her forehead cooled. She exhaled a long, soft sigh and fell into true sleep. I remember resting my cheek against the quilt and sobbing, sobs of relief, of exhaustion, of fear finally loosening its grip. When morning came and the doctor returned, he shook his head again, but this time in amazement. "Strong girl," he said. "Strong mother, too." I thought of all the hands that had stitched that quilt, all the scraps of lives sewn into it, all the nights it had held other people through their worst moments. "Strong quilt," I said softly. Have you ever realized that an object you thought was just old was really a witness, a quiet guardian who'd stood by you more faithfully than any lock or alarm system ever could? The years moved on. The world changed in ways my grandmother wouldn't have believed if she'd lived to see them. Televisions, then computers, then little glowing screens everyone carried in their pockets. New houses, new roads, new troubles. But through it all, the quilt stayed. Faded, yes. Frayed at the edges. Some of the older squares nearly transparent. Still, it stayed. When your mother left home for college, the first in our family to go, we hugged in the doorway until our bones hurt. Then I wrapped her in the quilt one last time. "So you don't forget where you come from," I said. She laughed and cried all at once. "Mom," she protested, "I can't take the whole quilt with me." "No," I said. "But you can take the stories. They're lighter than the fabric, but heavier than you know." These days, as another December rolls toward its end, this strange, modern December of 2025, where people order gifts from screens and packages arrive faster than we used to get letters, I find myself pulling the quilt out less. Its threads are too delicate now for daily use. But sometimes, when the wind has that old, familiar howl and loneliness creeps in around the edges of the windows, I spread it over my knees and listen. It rustles like leaves in a forest, like pages turning in a very long, very personal library. Every family has a story. Ours is written in corn husks, wood shavings, and uneven stitches. Now, with the quilt spread across the table, the corn husk doll resting on one corner, and the wooden soldier propped up near a faded square of James's handkerchief, I step back and look at it all. Here it is, our inheritance. Not stacks of bills. Not gold. Just a doll that once comforted cold children, a soldier that carried a dead boy's love forward, and a quilt that remembers more than any of us ever could. Tell me, does this look like poverty to you? On paper, we had so little. Our shoes were thin, our pantry sparse, our wallets almost always empty. We knew too well the taste of doing without. But sitting here, under the warm hum of the kitchen light, I see riches. I see a mother who gave up her own thread to tie a doll's waist. A brother who turned the last of his daylight into a gift for a scared sister. A grandmother who refused to throw away even the smallest scrap of a hard-earned life. Love stitched from scarcity keeps you warmer than blankets bought with excess. Have you ever looked around at all the bright, blinking things the world tells you to desire and felt, deep down, that maybe, just maybe, we've forgotten what real gifts look like? These days, children watch people open boxes on screens, boxes filled with gadgets and toys that will be outdated by next year, thrown aside when the next model appears. Unboxing videos, they call them. Carefully filmed hands slicing through plastic, peeling back tape, revealing something brand new and perfectly useless for building soul-deep memories. Once, long ago, we unboxed poverty without calling it anything at all. We opened our empty cupboards and found ways to stretch one meal into 3. We opened our tired hands and discovered they could create dolls and soldiers and quilts that outlived the worst winters we ever saw. Which do you think lasts longer in a child's heart, a toy that lights up and sings, or the memory of watching their mother's fingers dance through husks and thread, giving shape to something out of nothing? I'm not saying money doesn't matter. Lack of it can bend a person's back and spirit in ways I wouldn't wish on anyone. But I am saying this, money is only one kind of wealth. And in the quiet corners of poor houses, another wealth was always being born. We were poor in pockets, but we were rich in handmade love. Look again at this table. Imagine, instead of these old things, glossy catalog gifts piled high, things that never knew the warmth of human intention. Would I be here, decades later, telling you about them with tears in my eyes and a lump in my throat? Or would they be forgotten, like last year's advertisements, crumpled up and thrown away with the wrapping paper? Real wealth, I've come to believe, is measured in the stories that survive you. In the objects that, when touched, send a little shiver of recognition through generations. In the way your grandchildren's hands tremble, just a little, when they pick up your life and realize it fits in a shoebox, and yet feels too big for words. Have you ever opened a drawer, or a trunk, or a box in your own family home and felt something tug at your heart from inside? Maybe there's an old apron, stained by hundreds of meals cooked from mouths that never said, thank you, as often as they should have. Maybe there's a Bible with a cracked spine and notes in the margins, where someone you never met wrestled with hope and fear and faith. Maybe there's a photograph with corners curled from being handled, faces fading but still familiar. Those are your corn husk dolls. Your wooden soldiers. Your quilts. They may not look like much to someone scrolling past on a phone screen. But they are the wealth your ancestors were able to save for you when banks had nothing to offer them but rejection and indifference. So, here is what I want you to do after we close this lid tonight. I want you to go looking. Open the boxes in the attic. Ask the quiet elders in your family, what did you keep, and why? Listen not just to their answers, but to the pauses between their words. Will you do that? And when you find something, an object so worn it seems almost embarrassed to still exist, don't throw it away. Not yet. Hold it in your hands. Ask yourself, what story did this survive to tell? Because that's what these things are doing in my shoebox. They're not clutter. They're not junk. They're testimonies, sworn under oath by time and hardship, declaring that love was here. Now, before we finish, I want to ask you for a small favor. If this journey through my little box of nothing but love has stirred something in you, if it's made you remember a smell, a sound, a face you'd almost forgotten, then let that feeling live a little longer. Tap that like button so this story doesn't disappear into the noise. It doesn't cost you a thing, but it tells the world that stories like this matter. And if you'd like to sit at this table again, to hear more grandmother-style stories of families who turned scarcity into something sacred, then subscribe to Dust of Old Days. That way, whenever another box is ready to be opened, you'll have a seat waiting for you. Do you know someone who grew up with nothing, and yet somehow gave you everything? Share this with them. Say, look. Other people remember, too. This isn't just about my family, it's about yours. About all the families who survived hard winters with their dignity and tenderness intact. About all the children who grew up counting patches and whispering secrets into homemade toys. One day, long from now, someone will open a box with your name on it. What will they find? Receipts? Instruction manuals for things that no longer work? Or some small, worn object that carries the imprint of your love? You still have time to decide. Maybe, this year, instead of buying every gift you give, you'll make one. A letter written by hand. A recipe recorded on an index card in your own careful script. A scarf knit with drop stitches you fix and refix until it becomes part of the pattern. These things may look humble, but humility has always been where the best love hides. I gather the corn husk doll into my palm. Her husks are fragile, but she stands as straight as ever. Thank you, I whisper to her, to my mother's long tired hands, to that cold barn and the winter it warmed. I pick up the wooden soldier, feeling the smooth places carved out by younger fingers, my brother's most of all. Rest, I murmur. You did your duty. You carried what you were meant to carry. Finally, I fold the quilt, careful not to stress the oldest seams. It is heavier than it looks, dense with years. Sleep, I tell it softly. You've held enough cold nights for a lifetime. I place them all back into the shoebox, doll, soldier, quilt. I lay the lid on top, pressing it down until the cardboard edges meet. From the outside, it looks like nothing again. Just an old box, a bit warped, the logo of a shoe company that probably doesn't exist anymore fading into anonymity. But you and I, we know better now, don't we? We know that this is not an unboxing of poverty, but an unveiling of a different kind of prosperity. Not the kind that fills bank accounts and closets, but the kind that fills hearts and lingers in the air long after the last story has been told. Poverty, at its cruelest, tries to convince you that you are worth less because you have less. But gifts like these, born from empty pockets and full hearts, stand up to that lie. They say, we were here. We loved. We created. We endured. So when you hear the word poor, I hope you will remember this table. This box. This doll, this soldier, this quilt. Remember that sometimes, the richest families are the ones whose treasures fit into the smallest spaces. And the next time you watch someone online slice open a package and peel back layer after layer of plastic, ask yourself quietly. What will be left of that, when the batteries die and the fashion changes? What will be left of this? Then, think of a grandmother at a worn kitchen table, lifting the lid of a weathered box and unboxing a life crafted from nothing but love. That, my dear, is the kind of wealth no one can repossess.